So I'm on my way to Shepherd's Mulch to pick up a load of garden soil. They're going to dump a cubic yard of their landscaping mix in the back of my truck bed. This is my truck, Dry Bones. I made a video about it. You can check that out. It tells you the story of this whole truck and how it came to be. But in my video today, I want to talk to you about garden soil. What is it and why is it important in your garden? I want to talk about soil. It's something we don't think about. I mean, we walk on dirt and we walk on the ground all day long. You think you can just put some seeds in the ground and it'll grow. But what exactly is soil? What's in it? What makes soil good or bad for your garden? And where's the best place to get soil? We're going to talk about that in this video. So of course, soil is technically dirt. It is the thing that is naturally on the ground. Soil is right there on the top of the earth. And naturally, soil grows plants. I mean, you have weeds or you have flowers, you have grass, whatever that will grow in the dirt. But if we're looking at a garden, we want some specific characteristics in our soil in order for it to grow our gardens the very best and help them to be the most productive and most fruitful. So when we're talking about soil, the first thing you understand is topsoil. On the surface of the earth, the first foot or two of soil is topsoil. And topsoil in general, it contains a lot of different things, but the three main ingredients in the topsoil is sand, silt, and clay. And those are the three primary ingredients. Sand is typically between 0.05 millimeters and 2 millimeters. You know, everybody knows what sand is if you've ever been to a beach or if you've been on a playground and played in a sandbox. That's sand. It's very hard and rocky, and as far as the grains go, one grain of sand might seem really small, but compared to silt, it's actually rather big. Silt is between 0.002 and 0.05 millimeters. And clay is the finest of all. Clay is less than 0.002 millimeters. So topsoil tends to be very dense, very heavy, and it's hard to grow just plain topsoil, because it's just too dense and too heavy in most places. Now, you may live in a place that has very fertile topsoil, and that could be for various reasons. If you are blessed with some very fertile and rich and fluffy topsoil, then you are blessed indeed. Where I live is not the case. Certainly we can grow grass, although we even struggle growing grass sometimes because the soil here is very compacted. And so we have to work with it and work at it. Topsoil is usually not the best option for gardens or for containers, for pots, which you want to grow. It's too dense. It tends to lack nutrients. Now, some soils will be very rich in clay. And that actually, in some ways, is good, in some ways is bad. Clay soils are very hard and easily compacted and hard to work with, so you have to constantly keep breaking them up so that they'll be easier to work and so that the water can drain through it easier, because clay tends to hold on to water and doesn't drain well. And plants don't like to be sitting in water for long periods of time. They need water, but they want to be able to drink what they need and then have the water clear out. Sandy soil, on the other hand, drains water very quickly and very well, and it's also very easy to work. It's very fluffy, but unfortunately it doesn't tend to hold on to minerals very well. It doesn't have a lot of organic matter, and it tends to dry out too fast. Plants want to be able to get water when they need it, and unfortunately sandy soil tends to drain that water out really fast, which in some senses is good, but then it means that it's going to require more irrigation because that sandy soil is not going to hold on to any water. So if you wanted the perfect soil, it would sort of be a mixture between sand and clay. Another ingredient in soil is silt, which is in between sand and clay, and it tends to have a lot of organic matter in it as well. You may have noticed, you may go to a local nursery or garden center and you'll see bags of garden soil. What is garden soil? Well, garden soil has been formulated specifically with just the right ingredients in it to make it best for growing in your garden. Garden soil is a mixture of topsoil and sand blended with organic material like composted bark, mushroom compost, and composted cow or chicken manure. Those are things that contain a lot of nitrogen and is very important for making vegetables and plants and flowers grow well. So garden soil has been formulated to have just the right ingredients for growing soil in your ground. Garden soil is typically formulated to be put in on the ground and mixed in with your natural dirt wherever you live and whatever your location is. So garden soil is made to be mixed in like that. The garden soil that I use is called landscaping mix. I get it from a place locally here in my town called Shepherd's Mulch, and that's in Rocky Face, Georgia. The landscaping mix that I get is a mixture of topsoil, compost, sand, and pine frinds, which are small pieces of partially composed pine bark. It is a general purpose garden soil. It's sold in bulk, large quantities, and it's designed for landscaping companies that are maybe installing flower beds or shrubbery, things like that, in new homes that are being built or commercial buildings where they want to put in a flower bed. But it's also available for homeowners that are doing their own landscaping and shrubbery and such things like that. It costs $25 per cubic foot, which is, it's $25 per cubic yard, which is 108 cubic feet. And it's a very effective alternative, very inexpensive alternative to buying those small, expensive bags of garden soil. If you go to a place like Lowe's or Home Depot and you buy a bag of garden soil, you're going to pay a lot of money, and you're going to need to buy a lot of those bags maybe to fill up a large raised bed. It's much more economical to go to a place like Shepherd's Mulch and buy it in bulk. Of course, now if you're going to do that, you're going to need a truck or some kind of a trailer that can haul that dirt. They will load it with they have a front end loader with a big bucket, and they will dump it into the back of your truck or your trailer. But then once you get home, you're going to have to unload it yourself. But what I find is it's just so much better to do that. You think, well, you might not need that much soil, but what I find is I will always end up needing it at some point or another. So I will use what I need, and then I will put the rest in a little spot here in my yard and just keep it there because inevitably I'm going to need some more of it. The first year I really got into gardening, I was buying those little bags and they were just so expensive, and I bought them and I thought, well, I've got it. But then sure enough, later in the season, I expanded my garden. I needed some more soil and I had to go back and buy even more. So I went and I got a truckload of this soil and then just had it on hand. And then I keep the extra here in my yard and just use it whenever I need it. Now, garden soil is one type of soil Another type of soil that commercial companies make is called potting soil. Potting soil mix actually contains no natural soil. It doesn't have the topsoil necessarily in it. It is a combination of peat moss, ground pine bark, and perlite or vermiculite, and they also usually put in some plant food with it. Potting soil is usually sterilized with heat or with chemicals in order to kill any weed seeds that might be in it, and also eliminate any harmful microbes in the soil. Of course, when they do that, it also kills all of the beneficial microbes that are needed and that are helpful to plants to help them to absorb nutrients from the soil. So since there's no microbes in there to help them absorb that, they put that extra plant food in there to kind of offset it. Potting mix tends to be 2 to 3 times as expensive as garden soil, but it is lighter and fluffier, and it's formulated to be to drain better in a container. So it's supposed to be better for using in containers than garden soil. Now, seed starting mix is another type of potting soil, a specialized type of potting soil that is mixed to be the lightest and fluffiest potting soil available, and it's usually made with perlite, vermiculite, and peat moss. And again, it gets sterilized to get rid of any weed seeds and microorganisms. They don't want any of that stuff in your seed mix. You don't want anything competing with those seeds that you're planting in there. So you want to give them all of the absolute best possible chance with no competition of sprouting and doing well. So that's what seed starting mix is for. It's ideal for starting plants from seeds in seed trays or in small containers, and then you will take that and you will transplant it outside in your garden, or step it up into a larger pot at a later time. But the seed starting mix is just for getting the seed started for the first, 4 to 8 to maybe as far as 12 weeks. The consensus of gardening experts is you should use garden soil for in-ground and raised bed gardens. And you should use potting mix for indoor or outdoor containers or pots. Garden soil is supposed to be too dense in a pot or a container, and it chokes off the plant roots, doesn't drain well enough to use in containers. At least that's what the experts say. In my experience, and I'll admit I don't have a vast amount of gardening experience. Really, I've just been focusing on gardening for about 2 years. But I have been successful using garden soil in containers, both in large containers and in 5-gallon buckets, even some smaller like 1-gallon size containers. Last year, I grew Irish potatoes for the first time, and I grew them in, most of them I grew in 5-gallon buckets. This is, relatively small container, and I grew some of those potatoes in buckets that were filled with garden soil, and I grew some in buckets that were filled with potting mix. And I had a lot of people were warning me that the potatoes would not do well in garden soil in the buckets. But I honestly didn't really see a noticeable difference between the potatoes I grew in the garden soil or the potting mix. It's very interesting because potatoes are a root vegetable, and you would think that because they are root vegetables, they would be really strongly affected by the texture and the weight and the density of the soil and how well it drains. But in my case, they really weren't. I got the same amount of potatoes from the garden soil buckets as I did from the potting mix buckets. And I didn't really have any problems with the potatoes rotting in the buckets either. To me, a container is just another form of a raised bed. Of course, a raised bed tends to be maybe 3 or 4 feet wide, maybe 6 to 8 feet long, so it's spread out more and not necessarily as deep. But to me, the way I think about gardening is I think of a container as just being a very small raised bed. So why should garden soil work in a container? I'm not convinced that it doesn't, even though most of the experts say that it's best to use potting mix in a container. One thing I can tell you that is true, I would agree with the experts on this, that a bucket that is filled with garden soil is going to be a lot heavier than a bucket that's filled with potting mix. Potting mix is not as dense, so it's fluffier. And if you weigh the two together, yeah, the garden soil bucket is going to be a lot heavier. So if you're growing pots, then you're going to be moving them around, that might be something to consider. Using potting mix is going to be lighter and make it easier to make those around. That may be a factor. But when we're talking about using potting soil versus garden soil in buckets, what are the pros and the cons? In an in-ground or raised bed, you're going to have worms and other organisms that are going to help decompact the soil. So if you're using a bucket or a pot inside, you probably don't want insects and worms and all of that in your pot because it's going to be inside your house, right? So you don't want that there. Those worms are going to help decompact the soil. So if you're, inside, you don't want worms and things like that, so you use potting soil. But if you're outside and you're using a container, there's no reason why you shouldn't have insects and worms and microorganisms all in the bucket or the container. And those things can be outside. They can be decompacting your soil that's in your container. So soil compaction is going to reduce the air pockets in the soil. It's going to starve the roots and the oxygen. That's why you want that soil to be as fluffy as possible. So if you use a good garden soil that resists compaction, even if it's in a container, in my opinion, it's not going to be that big of a deal. And you can add things to it as well that might make it more friable. You could add a little bit of sand to it. You could certainly encourage and allow worms and other organisms to be in that bucket. It's going to help decompact that soil and keep it fluffier, which is going to help it drain, which is going to help oxygen get to the roots and all of those sorts of things. Another thing with containers outside, especially if you're making your own containers like I do, when I take a 5-gallon bucket, you're going to want to make sure it's got lots of good holes in the bottom, 1/4 inch to a 1/2 inch holes. I usually put 8 to 10 holes in the bottom of my bucket. And then you want to make sure, because if you put that pot or that bucket directly on the ground, it's going to be flat on the ground. That's going to affect how well it can drain. So you might want to raise it up. I typically put my buckets on like a pallet, or if I'm just going to be really simple about it, I might just stick a stick underneath one lip of the rim of the bottom of the bucket. It just sort of creates a slight gap between the bottom of the bucket and the soil, and that allows it to drain out easier. Another trick that I learned is just go around the outer edge of the bottom of that bucket and drill holes in the bottom, that way, not underneath but around the edge, because those holes are always going to be open. They're not going to be between the bottom of the bucket and the ground. So they're always going to be open and allow for better drainage. So I had a few buckets last year that I noticed the water was standing in them, that they weren't draining out. And I just went through, popped those holes around the edge of the bottom of the bucket, and immediately I didn't have a problem with drainage anymore. So if you use the right container and put the right kind of holes in it for drainage, and allow worms and things like that to be in the soil, use a good garden soil that drains well, then I don't see you really having a whole lot of problems with drainage by using garden soil in a container. Now, if you are growing plants inside, or if you're only growing a small number of plants outside, it may make sense to just go ahead and use potting soil. It might be feasible. Just know it's going to be a lot more expensive, but if you're only filling up a few containers, it's not going to be that much of a difference. But if you're like me, and I grow a lot of things in containers, I probably have 30 or 40 containers in my garden outside. And to fill that many containers up with potting soil, that's just going to be too expensive. So that's why I go to a landscaping company. I get the landscaping mix, and I put that garden soil in my containers and in my raised beds. and it works just fine for me. One of my favorite stories from Scripture is the creation story. And in the second chapter of Genesis, in the 7th verse, it tells how God made people from the dust of the ground. It says he made Adam from the dust of the ground. Of course, what is the dust of the ground? The dust of the ground is dirt, right? It's soil. And it also says that he took Adam and he put them in a garden. And so I love thinking about that story of how God put humanity in the garden to cultivate the soil. And, this was, according to the story, this was a time of perfection in human history. There was no corruption, there was no sin or anything like that. And, I don't know what you believe about the creation story, whether you take it literally or whether you take it just as a story that was told. I don't want you to get caught up in the details of all of that kind of stuff. And don't get caught up in the debate about whether it's supposed to be literal history or scientific or anything like that. But when you read that story from the first and the second and third chapter of Genesis, don't get caught up in all of those debates and all of that. Look at what the meaning for it is. What is the symbology of it all? And one of the things that you see is that God put people in a garden to take care of that garden. And this was a good thing. It was a joyous thing to work in the garden. It wasn't something that they had to do. They didn't even have to earn their food and, survive by the sweat of their brow at that point. This was before they had been disobedient to God. And so the idea was that this was paradise. It was paradise to be in the garden working. And, I don't know about you, but I kind of love working in my garden. It's one of the ways that I get away from the cares of the world and things like that. So, yeah, I enjoy it a lot. And I like thinking about that story like that. And it says that, God created Adam, the first man, from the dust of the earth. It's an interesting thing. Humans are linked to the earth. We're linked to the soil. The very word human, think about this, human, comes from the same, that word is also linked with the word like humus, which is a thing that's in the soil. It's the organic material that's in the soil. Humus, hummus, which you eat. If you ever had hummus before, you take a little cracker and you dip it in that hummus that's made from chickpeas or garbanzo beans and oil, and it's all ground up and it kind of looks like dirt or mud. And humility. What does it mean to be humble, right? It means to not think too highly of yourself. You are a special and you are an important person, but you are not greater than the earth. You're not a God. You're not as great as God, and you're not perfect. And you should be humble. And these words all come from the same root. Humans, humus, hummus, humility, all of these things. And they remind us that we are people of the earth. And we should be grounded. That's what it means to be humble, okay? Being humble doesn't, some people think of being humble as being just like self-deprecating all the time, having low self-esteem, and not really thinking, that you're important. That's not what being humble means. Being humble means being grounded. It means not thinking too highly of yourself. You are important and you are precious. You see, God made you, but He made you from the dust of the earth, so to speak. So being humble is neither thinking too highly of yourself nor thinking too low of yourself. Because of all of God's creation, the creation story reminds us that humans are the highest of all creation. And, whether you think of that creation story as being scientific or, literal or whatever, doesn't matter. All you got to do is observe the earth. And you can see that humans are the highest of all the animals. We are the only ones who have the power to make the world a better place or a worse place. We have the intelligence to do that. We have the intelligence to be good stewards of the garden of the earth in which God has placed us. We have the choice whether we will do that or not, whether we will be selfish and only do what is good for us, or whether we will be good stewards of what God has made and take care of the world. And so how we treat the animals around us, how we treat the plants in the garden that we tend, it says a lot about our character, right? Because these are things that don't have power. We have the power, but will we use it? Will we be humble and use it well? Or will we be conceited and selfish and only do what we want without regards to God's beautiful creation? Anyway, that's my thoughts for you today. So let's all get out there and let's grow and be fruitful.